was a quiet evening, the kind where the air felt a little too still, like the world had decided to hold its breath in anticipation. The kind of evening that seemed almost too perfect to be real. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale, silvery light over the house, the shadows stretching long across the grass. The faint hum of crickets was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves in the cool breeze. But inside, the house was alive with the chatter of voices, the soft clinking of glasses, the laughter of friends and family gathering together. It was Emma's birthday. She had always loved her birthdays. They were her day, her moment to be the center of attention, to feel special, surrounded by people who cared about her. And this year, her 28th birthday, was supposed to be no different. She had planned it meticulously. A cozy dinner party with close friends, some light music, and of course, the cake. A beautiful, decadent cake, just as she had imagined. She smiled as she glanced around the room, watching her friends and family mingling, enjoying the evening. But as the night wore on, there was an odd sense of unease that Emma couldn't shake. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling, like a shadow lurking at the edge of her perception. It started small, with little things that didn't seem to make sense. The way the room felt colder than it should have been, even though the windows were shut and the thermostat was set comfortably warm. The way the lights flickered for just a fraction of a second, like a brief, imperceptible glitch in the world. She pushed it aside, determined not to let her mind wander to dark places on her special day. But as the evening continued, the feeling only intensified. The laughter grew more hollow, the conversations more distant, as if her guests were no longer fully present. The sound of their voices seemed to echo unnaturally in the room, like they were speaking through a veil, and the warmth of the room felt more like an illusion, the cold seeping through her skin, making her shiver despite herself. Emma excused herself from the gathering, stepping out into the hallway for a moment to collect her thoughts. The corridor was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the chandelier from the living room. She could still hear the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation from the party, but they felt distant, as though they were coming from somewhere far away. She leaned against the wall, rubbing her temples, trying to steady her breathing. She didn't know why, but something about tonight felt wrong. As she stood there, lost in thought, a soft sound caught her attention. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, a scratching, like nails running along the wooden floor. Emma straightened, her heart skipping a beat. She looked around, but the hallway was empty. She could still hear the noise, though, coming from further down the corridor. The sound was slow, deliberate, and it was growing louder, closer. Her breath caught in her throat, and she took a hesitant step forward, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpet beneath her. The scratching was louder now, almost frantic, like something was trying to claw its way through the wall. She stopped at the end of the hallway, near the door that led to the basement. The scratching was coming from there. She was sure of it. Her mind raced. She tried to reason with herself, to dismiss the sound as nothing more than a trick of the house settling or the wind outside. But something deep inside told her that wasn't it. The air had changed. It felt thicker now, heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath. The scratching continued, relentless. It was like something or someone was trapped inside, trying to get out. Emma swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. The thought of going down to the basement, of opening that door, and facing whatever was making that noise, was terrifying. but she couldn't ignore it. Not tonight. With trembling hands, she reached for the doorknob. The metal felt cold against her skin, sending a chill up her spine. She turned it slowly, holding her breath, her heart racing in her chest. The door creaked open, and she peered into the darkness beyond. The basement was quiet now, eerily so, but Emma could feel the air shifting, the heavy silence pressing in around her. The scratching had stopped. She waited, her pulse thrumming in her ears, but there was no sound, no movement. The basement stairs stretched down before her, their steep decline swallowed by the shadows below. She knew she shouldn't go down there. She knew it was foolish, reckless even, but curiosity gnawed at her, pulling her forward. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, and she found herself stepping into the darkened stairwell, the door slowly closing behind her with a soft thud, hand trembling as she groped for the light switch, flicking it up with a click. The dim yellow glow of the basement light flickered on, casting long shadows against the walls, revealing shelves of old boxes, forgotten furniture, and dusty relics that seemed to have been left untouched for years. But there was something else, something that didn't belong. At the far corner of the basement, in the farthest, darkest part of the room, she saw a figure, a tall, thin silhouette that blended into the shadows so seamlessly it almost seemed like a trick of the light. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she froze, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. It was simply there, standing in the dark corner, watching her. Emma felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body refused to obey. All she could do was stare, her wide eyes locked on the figure that seemed to belong to the darkness itself. The figure shifted. It was so subtle, so slow, that Emma wasn't sure she'd seen it at all. But then it moved again, and this time, she was certain. It was coming toward her, the shadow swallowing it as it took one agonizingly slow step after another. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic, deafening beat, and before she could think, before she could react, her legs moved on their own. She turned and ran up the stairs, her footsteps pounding in her ears, the darkness closing in around her. She could hear the sound of something following her, a soft shuffle, a dragging sound like feet scraping against the floor. She burst through the door and slammed it shut behind her, her chest heaving, her mind racing. The room seemed even colder now, the air thick with an oppressive weight. She spun around, expecting to see the figure in the hallway, but it was gone. The laughter from the party had stopped. The house was eerily silent now, and the stillness pressed against her, suffocating her. Emma's eyes scanned the room. Her friends and family were gone. The guests, the partygoers she had been surrounded by just moments ago, vanished. In their place there was a single cake on the table. Its frosting was smooth, perfect, except for one thing, the candle. A single flickering flame sat in the center of the cake, burning steadily in the otherwise still room. The light from the candle cast long shadows across the room, but it was the shadows on the cake that caught her attention. There, carved into the frosting, was a message, a simple message. "Happy birthday, Emma." Her blood ran cold as the room seemed to close in on her. The shadows shifted again, and she heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, yet unmistakably close. "We've been waiting for you." The flame flickered, and for the first time that night, Emma screamed. Emma's scream echoed through the house, sharp and jarring, reverberating in the stillness that had settled around her. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled backward, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The cake on the table, with its single candle flickering quietly, cast long, unnatural shadows across the room. The message on the frosting, "Happy Birthday, Emma," seemed to mock her, its neat lettering now distorted by her frantic breathing. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog that seemed to cloud her mind. She had to move. She had to get out, but her legs felt heavy, as if the floor beneath her had suddenly become sticky, reluctant to let her go. The whisper lingered in her ears, soft and distant, yet undeniably close. "We've been waiting for you." Her body froze, the words reverberating in her skull like an unwanted song. The room felt wrong, suffocating. She could hear the faintest rustle, like something brushing against the walls. But when she looked, there was nothing. No one. Just the empty, unwelcoming space. Her eyes darted back to the candle on the table, and her gaze lingered on the flickering flame. It wasn't the warm, comforting light of a celebration. It felt cold, unyielding, as if it were a beacon drawing something to her, something she couldn't see but knew was there. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and writhe, alive, constantly shifting, as if they were watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. Emma's pulse quickened, her senses on edge. She took a step backward, her mind racing for an explanation. Could this all be in her head? A trick of exhaustion or anxiety? No, something was wrong. She could feel it deep in her bones. The air had thickened, weighed down by something unexplainable, something ancient. It was as though the very house itself was alive, breathing, pulsing, with a presence she couldn't see but could certainly feel. The air in the basement was cold, stale, and damp. She could feel it against her skin, seeping through her clothes, chilling her to the bone. She reached out, the temperature in the room dropped, making her shiver despite the suffocating warmth that clung to her skin. Her eyes remained locked on the cake, the candle's flame now flickering wildly, almost as if it were struggling to stay lit. The shadows in the room seemed to creep closer, pressing against the walls, inching toward her. She was trapped. She felt the weight of the silence pressing in on her, the soft tick of the clock in the corner, the only sound breaking the quiet. She wanted to scream again, to call for help, but her throat felt constricted, tight as though something invisible was choking her. The stillness in the house was suffocating, broken only by the faintest noises, the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, the whisper of air through the cracks in the windows. With shaky hands, she reached for her phone, the only thing that might anchor her to reality, but her fingers fumbled as if the device were suddenly foreign to her. Her breath hitched when she saw the time. It was almost midnight. Her birthday had officially passed. Her heart skipped a beat. That's when she remembered the story. It was supposed to be a simple birthday, but she'd heard the stories before. Stories her grandmother used to tell of strange things happening on the eve of someone's birthday. Not just any birthday, their birthday. She'd brushed it off as an old superstition, a tale meant to entertain children during long, dark nights. But now, in the chill of the room, the flickering flame casting distorted shadows on the walls, Emma couldn't help but feel a deep, unsettling unease. The house seemed quieter now. The faint chatter and laughter from the party had long since faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that clung to the air. Emma's fingers gripped the phone tightly, her nails digging into the plastic. She had to find someone, anyone, But when she unlocked her phone and saw the list of missed calls and messages, a shiver ran down her spine. There was nothing, not a single message, no texts, no calls. It was as if the outside world had forgotten her entirely. She glanced back at the cake, the flame of the candle now flickering erratically, casting wild, frantic shadows across the room. For a split second, she could have sworn she saw a face in those shadows, a dark, twisted face grinning at her. Her stomach lurched, and she quickly turned away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. It was too much to process all at once. Think, Emma, think. She forced herself to take a slow breath, trying to calm the frantic pounding of her heart. But nothing made sense, none of it. The absence of her guests, the strange feeling in the room, the whispering voice. It was as if the very fabric of reality was starting to tear at the seams. She looked around, her eyes darting from corner to corner, scanning the shadows. But all she saw was the same oppressive darkness. The floor creaked again, and Emma's heart leapt into her throat. She whirled around, but there was nothing there. The air felt heavier, as if something was shifting, pressing in on her from all sides. Her eyes locked on the stairwell leading up to the second floor, a path she had taken only moments before. The shadows there seemed to stretch unnaturally, darker and deeper than they should have been. Something was up there. She could feel it. With shaky hands, Emma made her decision. She had to leave the room, had to get away from the suffocating atmosphere that seemed to press in on her, make her feel like she was suffocating. Slowly, she backed away from the table, her eyes never leaving the candle. It felt like it was watching her, as if it were alive and aware of her every move. Her foot brushed against the floor, making a soft, scraping sound that echoed in the silence. Emma froze. She had not made that noise. It wasn't her foot. She could feel it, a presence behind her, something just out of her line of sight. She whipped around, expecting to see something, anything, but there was only the empty room, only the shadows. The silence was deafening now, broken only by her rapid breathing. She didn't know where to go, what to do. Her mind was racing, spinning in circles, trying to make sense of it all. She wanted to scream again, but she knew it wouldn't help. No one was coming. She was completely alone. Then she heard it, the sound of footsteps. Soft at first, almost imperceptible, like someone was walking on tiptoe. But the steps grew louder, closer, until Emma could hear the distinct sound of shoes scuffing against the floor. Her breath caught in her throat, her body frozen with fear. She looked towards the doorway. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. She could hear them, still lingering right on the edge of her hearing. They were too close now, too close for comfort. But there was no one there. Her hand shook as she reached for the door, the metal handle cool against her skin. She turned it slowly, desperately, and the door creaked open with a groan that sent a shiver down her spine. She stepped out into the hallway, her eyes scanning the darkness. But the house was empty and silent, save for the steady ticking of the clock in the distance. As Emma moved further down the hallway, she heard something else. Whispers. Soft at first, so soft she wasn't sure they were real. But then they grew clearer, louder. They were words, but they weren't words she recognized. Come back. Stay. We've been waiting. Emma's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of the house pressing in on her, the air thick with something malevolent. Something was waiting for her. Something had always been waiting. Emma's breath quickened as the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if they were circling her, breathing down her neck. She froze. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere, their source impossible to pinpoint, like they were embedded in the walls themselves. "Come back. Stay. We've been waiting." The last phrase felt like it was directly in her ear, the breath warm, though the temperature in the house had dropped sharply. She shivered uncontrollably, her hands clammy as they gripped the railing of the staircase. The hallway stretched ahead, too dark for her to see beyond a few feet. The light from the candle behind her flickered once more, casting long, wild shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward her, their limbs twisting like the fingers of some unseen force reaching out. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog of panic clouding her thoughts. She couldn't think straight. "Think, Emma. Think." She glanced over her shoulder, expecting the shadows to crawl closer. Her eyes met nothing but the faint glow of the candle she had left behind on the table. The faint outline of the cake, its message still eerily clear, stood mocking her. She wasn't sure why, but that cake suddenly seemed so out of place, almost like it was a sign, something meant to trap her here. She forced herself to move, every step feeling heavier than the last, like the floor beneath her feet was slowly pulling her down. Each footstep echoed louder than the one before, and as she ascended the stairs, the oppressive silence in the house seemed to deepen. It was no longer just quiet. It was suffocating, as though the very air had become thick, almost viscous. Her mind screamed for her to turn back, but she didn't. Not yet. She needed to see what was waiting for her upstairs. Every instinct told her she should run, but something deeper than fear, compelled her to move forward. She couldn't explain it, but the pull was there, something pulling her toward the unknown, something ancient that she couldn't escape. The second-floor hallway was just as dark, its only light coming from a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, swaying slightly as though disturbed by a gust of wind. But the air was still, suffocatingly so. Emma could hear the faintest creak of the old floorboards beneath her as she took cautious steps down the hallway, her body tensing at every sound. She could feel the weight of the house pressing in on her, the walls seeming to close in with each step. She could hear something, too, a low hum, barely audible, but there, buzzing in the back of her mind. The further she went, the louder it became. It was coming from the room at the end of the hallway, the only door that was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Come closer." She hesitated just for a moment, but there was no turning back. Not now. She was so close. With a deep breath, Emma pushed the door open. The room inside was shrouded in near total darkness, save for the faintest light that seemed to pulse from somewhere within. She squinted, trying to make sense of the odd, shifting shadows, but nothing was clear. Her eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room, where something lay still, obscured in darkness. The air in here felt different, warmer, thicker, almost as if the room itself was alive. The same unnatural pull she had felt on the stairs was stronger here, like invisible hands gripping at her, urging her to move closer. Emma took a cautious step inside. Her breath caught in her throat when she heard something soft, barely perceptible, shift behind her. She whipped around, her heart racing, but there was nothing. Nothing at all. She blinked, trying to steady her nerves, but her mind was racing, spiraling into panic. Her eyes returned to the corner. She didn't want to go any further, but something in her gut told her she had no choice. room seemed to beckon her, drawing her in like a moth to a flame. She had to know what was there, what had been waiting for her all this time. The floor beneath her feet creaked again, louder this time, and she turned her head quickly. Nothing, but the sensation of being watched, of something standing just behind her, was overwhelming. Her skin prickled as if invisible eyes were boring into her back. She couldn't take it anymore. She moved toward the corner, her feet carrying her almost without thought, her steps growing faster, as if she were no longer in control. The door slammed shut behind her with a force that made her jump, the sound reverberating off the walls like a gunshot in the silence. The room seemed to close in around her, the air growing thick, oppressive. And then she saw it. The faint glow was coming from a small object, placed carefully in the center of the floor. As she moved closer, the details became clearer. It was a small, cracked mirror. The edges were jagged, as though it had been shattered and pieced back together. But the reflection it held was not her own. It was something else, something dark, something ancient. Her reflection was warped, distorted, as if it were a reflection from another world. Emma felt her pulse race in her throat, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the mirror. But before she could, the surface rippled like water, and the reflection that stared back at her grinned. A twisted, mocking grin that was not her own. It was as if the figure in the mirror was alive, aware of her, and it was grinning at her in that moment, mocking her presence. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Emma's breath misted in front of her face. Her feet froze to the ground as she stared at the mirror, transfixed by the figure grinning at her. The room seemed to close in on her, and she could hear the whispers again, louder now, clearer. "We're waiting for you." The figure in the mirror reached out, its hand moving toward her, the reflection of its fingers stretching across the glass, as if it were trying to pull itself through. Emma's heart thudded in her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She took a step back, but the mirror's grip on her seemed stronger than ever, and the reflection in the glass pulled itself further out, reaching for her with long, thin fingers. Her pulse raced, and her legs buckled beneath her as she stumbled backward. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the mirror, couldn't tear herself from the dark, hollow stare that seemed to pierce through her very soul. The room seemed to pulse with energy, with a life of its own, and Emma realized, too late, that it wasn't the mirror that had trapped her. It was the house itself. The whispers turned into words. "You shouldn't have come." And then the door slammed open behind her. The figure in the mirror smiled wider, its face growing more grotesque by the second. Emma spun around, but no one was there. The door was open, but the hallway beyond was just as dark, just as empty. Still, the oppressive feeling in the room hadn't gone away. It was only getting stronger. The whispers stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than anything she had felt before. It was waiting. Emma stood in the eerie stillness of the room, her mind unable to process what had just happened. The figure in the mirror, its face twisted and grotesque, its fingers reaching out for her, was all she could see. She was suffocating in the thick air that seemed to close in on her with every breath. Her hands shook as they gripped the edge of the shattered mirror, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps. For a moment, everything felt too unreal. The whispers had stopped, but their presence lingered in the back of her mind, a hum that resonated deep within her skull. The door was wide open now, but the hall beyond it was just as dark as the room she stood in, just as suffocating. Every instinct in her screamed to run, but her feet refused to move. The silence was deafening. Every second stretched on endlessly, like the room was holding its breath, waiting. She could still feel the pull of something in the air, something that was watching, something that was waiting for her to make the next move. Emma blinked rapidly, trying to clear her thoughts, but the images from the mirror, the grotesque reflection, the twisted grin, remained burned into her mind. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the dim room, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. There was no sign of anyone or anything, no noise except for the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. But she could still feel it, a presence, not just behind her but around her, pressing in from all sides, suffocating her. She was no longer alone in the room. She had never truly been alone. The door was still open, but it felt like a trap that she had walked into willingly. The hallway was dark, deeper than it should have been, the shadows stretching unnaturally far down its length. She knew the stairs were just beyond the hallway, but they felt miles away, unreachable. She could hear nothing, no creaks from the floorboards, no whispers, but the air felt too thick, too heavy. It was as if something in the darkness was waiting for her to take another step. The room seemed to close in on her again, its walls pressing inward, breathing with her. She wasn't sure if it was the house, or if it was her mind that was playing tricks on her, but it felt as though the space itself was alive. Her vision blurred slightly, and she had to fight to stay grounded, to keep herself from slipping into a panic she couldn't control. Her hand brushed the wall beside her, instinctively reaching out for something solid to hold onto, and she felt the cold, damp surface of the plaster under her fingertips. Her breath quickened again, the temperature in the room dropping even more sharply. She could feel the chill seeping into her skin, into her bones, the kind of cold that wasn't just physical. It was a coldness that dug into the soul. With an effort, she tore her gaze away from the door and turned back to the room. The mirror, still shattered on the floor, gleamed faintly in the low light. Emma swallowed hard, her mouth dry, her throat tight. The reflection, no, the thing in the mirror, was still etched in her mind. But now there was something else, a new presence, something she hadn't noticed before, lingering in the corners of the room, something in the shadows, just out of reach, just beyond the edge of her perception. She felt a deep unease settle in her stomach, a gnawing feeling that something was about to happen, but she didn't know what, and she didn't know how to stop it. The quiet was maddening, and then she heard it, the faintest noise, a creak, far off, deep within the walls. It was a sound she couldn't quite place, like the movement of something heavy shifting in the darkness. She froze, listening intently. The house groaned again, and this time she could feel the vibrations in the floor, in the walls, beneath her feet. The ground itself felt unstable, shifting, as if the entire structure was on the verge of collapsing. Her heart began to pound in her chest as the noise grew louder. It was unmistakable now. Something was moving, something large. But the movement wasn't coming from the outside. It wasn't coming from the stairs or the hallway. It was coming from within the walls, from the very fabric of the house itself. A soft whisper fluttered in her ear. "We can't let you leave." Emma jerked back, her hand slapping against the wall as she stumbled away from the door. Her breathing grew erratic, her vision narrowing in on the space before her. The sound of the creaking grew louder, louder, until it filled her ears, drowning out everything else. It was accompanied by a strange thudding now, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. She wanted to run. She needed to run. But the house, no, the walls themselves, seemed to be closing in on her, the air growing even thicker, the space between the room and the hall narrowing with every passing second. Her feet were rooted to the spot, as though the ground beneath her had turned to quicksand, holding her in place, forcing her to listen, to wait. The thudding came again, closer this time. Her eyes darted toward the broken mirror, still lying in the corner. The jagged shards reflected the faint light from the candle at her feet. But there was something wrong with the way the light flickered. It was moving too quickly, dancing unnaturally, casting strange shadows that writhed in the corners of her vision. She could have sworn that the pieces of the mirror moved, shifting positions. But when she looked again, they were exactly where they had been, scattered on the floor. "It's not real," she told herself, her voice a hoarse whisper in the silence. "It's not real." But then the whispering returned, and this time it was louder, more insistent. "You can't run from us." The sound of feet moving behind her made her spin and around. There was nothing there. The room was empty, but the footsteps, slow and deliberate, were still echoing in her ears. The walls seemed to pulse with each step, vibrating in time with her racing heartbeat. The whispers shifted again, taking on a new tone, soft, soothing, like a lullaby, but undercut with something darker. "Stay with us, Emma. Stay forever." She could feel the pressure building in the air, the weight of something unseen pressing down on her chest, forcing the breath from her lungs. She could see the shadows stretching farther now, reaching out toward her like tendrils, pulling her closer, suffocating her. Her hands gripped the edge of the broken mirror again, the sharp glass cutting into her fingers as she fought to steady herself. But it wasn't helping. She could feel the room closing in, the walls pulling her tighter, the shadows reaching toward her, creeping along the floor, the ceiling, the corners. There was no escape, no way out. The whispering became a chant, low and steady, repeating over and over, a sound that filled her mind, drowned out everything else. "Stay with us. Stay with us." She could feel something behind her now, something cold, something that made her skin crawl. Slowly, she turned, and the room fell silent once more. There was no one there. The thudding had stopped. The shadows had receded. But Emma knew. She knew something was watching her. Something had been watching her from the moment she had stepped inside the house. The weight of its gaze pressed heavily on her chest, suffocating her. She couldn't move. The air grew colder and the house seemed to shift, as though it had become something else, something alive, something that wasn't going to let her leave. The air in the house was thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though every time she turned around, the room was empty. The sounds had stopped. No creaking floors, no whispers in the dark. Yet, there was a weight in the silence that pressed against her chest, threatening to suffocate her. Her eyes darted around the room. She needed to leave. She needed to find the exit, to get out of this house. But the door seemed miles away, and with every step she took, the hallway beyond felt more distant. The walls appeared to be shifting, moving closer, warping the space between her and the rest of the world. She tried to take a step forward, but her legs felt like lead. The house was pressing in on her, and every movement was sluggish, as if her body had become too heavy for the world it was in. The mirror in the corner of the room caught her eye again. The shards of glass were like jagged teeth, sharp and unrelenting. She had to turn away. She couldn't look at it any longer, not after what she'd seen, not after what had happened when she'd first glimpsed her reflection. But as she looked away, she swore she saw something in the corner of the glass, a dark shape lingering in the reflection, just beyond the corner of her vision. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if she'd imagined it, or if the figure had been there all along. Slowly, her hand reached out, almost of its own accord, toward the shattered mirror. She hesitated, but the pull was undeniable. There was something about it, something that made her stomach twist with both dread and curiosity. The shards of glass seemed to shimmer in the dim light, almost beckoning her closer. The piece in the farthest corner, the largest one, seemed to glow faintly, as if it had a life of its own. Her fingers brushed against it, and the sharp edge bit into her skin. She winced, but she didn't pull away. Instead, her gaze moved, drawn to the small reflection of herself in the glass. The faint outline of her own face stared back at her, pale and wide-eyed. But something was wrong. The image was too still, too empty. Her reflection didn't blink, didn't breathe. It simply stared, its eyes vacant, and Emma felt a cold rush of unease wash over her. She jerked her hand back, stumbling away from the mirror as a wave of dizziness overcame her. Her vision blurred. For a moment she thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye, but when she turned to look, the room was empty. Her mind was playing tricks on her. Or was it? A low hum began to fill the room, soft at first, like a far-off whisper carried by the wind. Emma pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder until the sound seemed to resonate within her very bones. It wasn't the walls. It wasn't the house. The sound was coming from inside her own head. Stay. Her body stiffened. She felt her heart skip a beat. Stay with us. It was a whisper, but it was everywhere. In her mind, in the walls, in the air. It surrounded her, curling around her thoughts like a serpent, squeezing tighter. With every passing second, Emma's breathing quickened. She stumbled backwards, her hands grazing the wall for balance, but it felt wrong. The walls felt slick, soft, not solid. Her fingers pressed into the surface, and it gave beneath her touch, as though the house itself was pulsing, breathing in time with her frantic heartbeats. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward her. The corners darkened, twisting, elongating, and the walls seemed to narrow. The air was thick with the oppressive weight of something unseen, something that was closing in around her. She could feel it now. It was there, in the room with her. Whatever it was, whatever had been watching her since she stepped inside, was growing closer. She spun around, her chest tight, her pulse pounding in her ears. There was nothing there, but the room was different now, wasn't it? The shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They were moving. They were shifting, crawling along the edges of the walls, creeping down toward her. She had to leave. She had to run, but the door was too far. Her legs wouldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the creeping darkness, from the strange, liquid-like shadows that writhed and coiled around the room. The air was becoming colder, thick with an unnatural chill, like a fog that seeped into her skin and froze her bones. Suddenly the whispers returned, louder this time, cutting through the thick silence like a blade. Come closer. Emma's eyes widened. She wasn't imagining this. She wasn't alone. The voice, soft and insistent, called out from the shadows, echoing through her mind, pulling at her like an invisible force. It's your birthday, Emma. Her throat tightened. The The words felt like a curse. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were demands. You belong here. The walls groaned, a deep, guttural sound that rumbled through the floor beneath her feet. The temperature dropped even further, and Emma could see her breath fogging in front of her. The darkness felt alive now, as though it had substance, as though it could reach out and touch her. Her eyes flicked back to the mirror, and she saw it again. The figure. But this time, it wasn't just a vague shape. It was clear. The same distorted face, twisted and unnatural, grinning back at her from the shards of glass. The eyes were wide open, black as night, unblinking, staring right through her. The shadows seemed to lengthen again, and before she knew it, Emma's feet were moving on their own, taking her toward the mirror. It was as though her body was no longer in her control. She couldn't stop herself. She wanted to scream, to run, but the whispers wrapped around her mind, suffocating her thoughts. "Stay with us, Emma." The voice was louder now, coming from every direction. The walls, the mirror, the floor. All of it was calling to her. The shadows were alive. Her hands reached out toward the glass, and as her fingertips brushed against the cold shards, a sharp, painful jolt shot through her. The air thickened, and for a moment, the room seemed to twist. The floor beneath her buckled, and the walls seemed to fold in on themselves. "Stay with us." The voice grew louder. "Stay forever." Her reflection in the glass started to move on its own, twisting into something darker, something wrong. It smiled at her, a wide, gaping grin that stretched impossibly far across its face. The eyes were empty, hollow, a black abyss staring back at her, and Emma's breath caught in her throat. No, this wasn't her. This wasn't real, but it was real. She was trapped. The shadows were all around her now, curling up her arms, her legs, pulling her into their cold, suffocating embrace. She could feel them closing in on her, and she realized with a sickening certainty that the house wasn't just alive. It was feeding on her fear, on her confusion, on her terror. Her reflection in the mirror began to twist again, distorting into something grotesque, something that should never have been. Its grin grew wider, and its eyes locked onto hers, the emptiness in them like a void, pulling her in. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the air grew cold once again. The voice, now a chorus of whispers, whispered in unison, "You're ours now." The walls seemed to close in around her, and she could feel the shadows pressing against her, curling around her, pulling her deeper into the dark. The house was consuming her, swallowing her whole. She was no longer Emma. She was just another lost soul trapped within these walls, another whisper in the dark. And the darkness was waiting for the next person to step inside. Emma stood motionless in the center of the room, her heart racing. The air around her felt thick, oppressive, as if it was pressing in from all sides, suffocating her. She tried to take a deep breath, but the cold air seemed to freeze her lungs, making it impossible to inhale deeply. It was as though the very atmosphere had become heavier, laden with an unseen weight. The shadows that clung to the corners of the room were no longer static. They moved, undulating in the corners of her vision. She tried to focus, to make sense of it all, but every time she looked at them directly, they seemed to shrink away, just beyond her reach. Her hand trembled as she reached out for the wall to steady herself. The surface was cold to the touch, colder than she would have expected. As she traced her fingers along the edge, she felt the texture change. Smooth, slick, as if the wall was coated in something viscous. A shiver ran down her spine. She pulled her hand away quickly, her eyes darting around the room. The house felt different now, as though the walls themselves were shifting, slowly creeping toward her. The floors beneath her feet creaked, but not in the way they had before. This wasn't the familiar groan of an old house settling. This was something deeper, more unsettling, as if the very foundation of the house was shifting, inching closer to something unknown, something dark. Emma's eyes snapped to the door, but it seemed miles away. She had no idea how long she had been standing there, frozen in place. But she knew she couldn't stay any longer. She needed to leave. But her legs felt heavy, like lead, and with each attempt to move, she found herself rooted to the spot. The whispers returned, but this time they were louder, clearer, echoing in her mind, each word laced with an unholy urgency. Stay. Her stomach churned. She spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but the room was still empty. There was no one. Nothing. But the air was thick with the presence of something, or someone, that she couldn't see. Stay with us. The voice was now joined by others, an eerie chorus that made her skin crawl. They were everywhere, surrounding her. She couldn't tell if they were coming from the walls, the floor, or from inside her own mind. But the effect was the same. The voices were growing louder, more insistent. She pressed her hands to her ears, hoping to block them out, but it was futile. The whispers filled her head, weaving into her thoughts like a dark web she couldn't escape. You're ours now. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The words felt like ice, freezing her in place. A sense of dread washed over her, more powerful than anything she had ever felt. She felt it in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing, twisting sensation that made her feel as though the ground beneath her feet was disappearing. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, despite the windows being shut tight. It rushed past her, making her hair whip around her face. The room seemed to distort, the walls bending inwards as if they were closing in on her. The air grew colder, sharper. She could see her breath now, a thin mist in the air. The shadows moved again, but this time they weren't just creeping along the edges. They were expanding, stretching, forming shapes. For a moment, Emma thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye. She turned sharply, but there was nothing there, only the flickering of the shadows, twisting unnaturally in the corners of the room. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something waiting. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up. She took one step, then another, and before she knew it, she was walking toward the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't the same. The figure in the glass seemed off. The edges of her reflection were blurred, the colors distorted, and her eyes were too wide, too empty. She stopped, paralyzed by the sight. It was like staring into the depths of a void. Her reflection was moving on its own, slowly tilting its head to the side, grinning, as though it knew something she didn't. She reached out a hand, trembling. Her fingers brushed against the cold glass, and she recoiled instantly. The glass wasn't just cold, it was freezing. It burned like ice against her skin. Her breath hitched in her throat as she tried to step back, but the room seemed to tilt, the walls warping, bending in ways they shouldn't. The air grew thicker, more suffocating. It felt as though the house itself was alive, its walls breathing with her, pulsing in rhythm with her racing heart. She stumbled backward, but her feet tangled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor. The sound of her body hitting the ground echoed in the empty room. She scrambled to her feet, panic rising in her chest. She had to get out. The door was still so far away, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The shadows were closing in on her, growing longer, more twisted. She had to run, but as she tried to move, her body refused. It was as though the house had its grip on her, holding her in place. Her head swam with dizziness. The whispers grew, louder, more insistent, now overlapping each other, melding into a single, terrible chorus. Come closer. Her body was trembling with fear now, but she couldn't stop herself. The whispers were too powerful. They were filling her head, drowning out every other thought. She took one step, then another, drawn to the mirror. She didn't know why. She didn't know what she was doing. She only knew that she couldn't resist the pull. The reflection in the glass twisted again. The face in the mirror grinning wider, its eyes black and empty, watching her with a malevolent glee. The air around her grew colder. She could see the frost forming on the walls, creeping along the floor. Her breath came out in jagged gasps, the cold biting at her skin. The house felt as though it was closing in on her, suffocating her in its dark embrace. The shadows were everywhere now, moving like tendrils, reaching for her, crawling along the walls, the floor, the ceiling. She took another step toward the mirror, unable to stop herself. Her reflection smiled wider, its mouth stretching impossibly far. It wasn't her anymore. It was something else, something that didn't belong. The whispers turned into a roar in her mind, deafening, overwhelming. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside her head now, louder than anything else. You are ours. She froze in place, her entire body trembling. The voice was too close now, so close she could feel it inside her, in her bones, in her very soul. Her reflection in the glass was no longer even recognizable. It was something monstrous, a twisted, grotesque version of herself, smiling, waiting. And then, as the shadows enveloped her, she understood. She understood that the house wasn't just alive. It wanted her, but it didn't want her to leave. It never wanted her to leave. The reflection reached out a hand, and she followed, helpless, her body moving without her will. The shadows reached for her, pulling her in. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was no escape. The room spun, the walls closing in, and the whispers surrounded her, louder and louder. Stay with us. The darkness swallowed her whole, and the last thing she saw was her reflection, grinning back at her. The room felt colder as Emma's feet shuffled across the floor, her body tense with each hesitant step. The mirror still gleamed in front of her, an icy reflection staring back, as though it were no longer just a glass, but something far darker. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to flicker, elongating and shifting as though they had a life of their own, watching her every movement. The whispers were constant now, filling her mind with an urgent, pleading sound that she couldn't escape. Stay with us, stay with us. Emma wanted to scream. She wanted to run, to break free of the suffocating grip of the room, but her legs felt like lead. Every attempt to move was met with resistance, as if the very air itself was holding her in place. She looked around again, her eyes darting, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the room seemed to change with every passing second. The walls were not quite where they had been before. The angles were off. She swore she could hear faint scratching, a scuttling noise that seemed to come from all directions. She tried to pinpoint it, but it was elusive, like a phantom sound that slipped away. Whenever she focused too hard, the temperature was plummeting further. Her breath came out in ragged clouds, each exhale leaving a faint mist in the air. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stave off the cold, but it was no use. It felt as though the chill was coming from within her, freezing her from the inside out. The shadows seemed to grow thicker, enveloping her in a shroud that closed in tighter with every passing moment. The whispers intensified as though they were trying to reach her mind directly, bypassing all rational thought, all defense. They weren't just words anymore. They were commands, unyielding and insistent. You can't leave. You will never leave. Her pulse quickened. The sensation of being watched grew sharper, more distinct. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. She was certain there were eyes on her, everywhere. She could sense them, unseen but always present, lingering in the corners of her vision, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She turned, and the shadows seemed to move with her, darting out of her line of sight whenever she tried to look directly at them. And then, something shifted. The space behind her, the space that had once been the doorway to escape, wasn't there anymore. It was as if the wall had grown, expanding, sealing her into the room. She spun around, her breath hitching as her heart hammered in her chest. The door was gone. There was no way out. Panic surged through her, but her legs refused to cooperate. She staggered back toward the mirror, drawn to it as if some force was compelling her to approach. She tried to focus on the reflection again, but this time it was different. The edges of the mirror were starting to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. The face staring back at her wasn't hers, at least not entirely. The eyes were darker, hollowed out, and the skin stretched too tight over the bones, a grotesque mockery of her own image. It smiled at her, not with any warmth or recognition, but with the twisted malice of something that was not human. Her body moved without her consent. Her feet shuffled closer to the mirror, her fingers trembling as they reached toward the cold glass. She didn't want to touch it. She didn't want to be this close to it, but she couldn't stop herself. Something was pulling her in. The coldness of the mirror seeped through her fingers, sharp and biting. Her breath caught in her throat, and a flood of nausea hit her, threatening to overwhelm her. But she couldn't look away. The reflection in the mirror was changing again. Her own face was distorting, warping into something else entirely. It twisted, the features melting away, as if they were being reshaped by some unseen hand, an ungodly force that sought to replace her very being. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears as she fought to tear her gaze away, but it was impossible. She was trapped, caught between the mirror and the oppressive weight of the room, closing in on her. "Stay with us." The whisper echoed in her mind again, louder this time, insistent and forceful. It was a command, not a request. The voice wasn't coming from any one place. It was coming from everywhere. From the walls, from the floor, from the mirror, from deep within her own skull. "We're waiting for you." She could feel something more now. The air felt thick with a presence, something ancient and malevolent, watching her every movement with hungry anticipation. The shadows in the room seemed to twist into shapes now, long, spindly arms reaching out toward her, their fingers stretching, curling like vines around the edges of her vision. Her heart slammed painfully in her chest as the world around her seemed to narrow down to nothing but the voice and the shadows. It was as though the house itself was alive. It had always been alive, and now it was waking, stretching, calling her to it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, Everything went still. The voices stopped. The shadows froze. The air felt stagnant, thick and oppressive. For a long moment, Emma stood there holding her breath, afraid to move. The silence was deafening, but it was a silence that felt wrong, as though it were pregnant with something. The quiet was not peace. It was a waiting, a breath held in anticipation. She took a step back. Another. Her legs felt like jelly, but she had to keep moving. She had to find a way out. But then, a low, guttural sound echoed through the room. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was something else. Something dark and visceral. A scraping, dragging noise that came from behind her, from the depths of the shadows that had been growing in the corners. She dared not turn around, but the sound grew closer, louder, more persistent, like claws against stone, dragging their way toward her. Her breath quickened as she spun around, her eyes scanning the room. Nothing, but the shadows were no longer in the corners. They were moving now, crawling, slithering across the floor like dark liquid, pulling toward her feet. She stumbled back, her heart pounding against her rib cage. She tried to run, but it felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting, changing, as if the room was swallowing her whole. The walls were closing in. The air was suffocating. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The shadows were everywhere now, climbing up her legs, tugging at her, pulling her toward the mirror. She screamed, but the sound was muffled, lost in the oppressive silence of the room. She tried to pull away, but it was no use. The shadows had her now, crawling over her, slipping into her clothes, into her skin, until she could feel them inside her, curling into her veins, sinking into her very bones. The mirror reflected everything back at her, but it wasn't just her face anymore. It was her entire body, twisted and contorted by the shadows, as if they had already consumed her, taken her completely. The face that looked back at her wasn't hers anymore. It was something else, something wrong, something alive. The last thing Emma felt was the cold, creeping sensation of something sliding into her mind. Something that wasn't her own. Something that had always been there, waiting for her to arrive. And then, the room was silent once more. The mirror was empty. The shadows were gone. And Emma was nowhere to be found. The stillness in the room was suffocating. Emma's breath came in short, shallow gasps, each one a desperate attempt to find air in the thick, oppressive silence that now surrounded her. Her eyes flicked from corner to corner, but the shadows, once writhing in the periphery, were now still, too still. It felt as if the whole room had frozen, as though everything was holding its breath, waiting. She took a tentative step forward, her footfall a soft echo in the vast emptiness. The air tasted wrong, heavy with something she couldn't quite name, something ancient and bitter. Her skin prickled, a tingling sensation creeping across her body, as though the very walls were pushing against her, squeezing in closer with every movement she made. She instinctively backed away, only to find that the space around her had already shrunk. The door was still gone. The mirror was no longer where it had been, no longer reflecting her frantic movements. Instead, it was sitting off to the side, a few feet away from its original place, as if it had been shifted in the middle of the night without her knowing. It was angled slightly away from her, its surface clouded with condensation, though the room was not particularly humid. It wasn't cold either, yet she could see her breath in front of her, just like before. But it was different now. It felt different. She moved toward it again, cautiously, with hesitant steps. Her reflection was faint at first, barely discernible behind the mist gathering on the surface. She could barely make out the outline of her face, the hollow eyes staring back at her, eyes that seemed so empty. The longer she stared, the more distorted the reflection became. Her face began to blur, as if it were melting under a heat she couldn't feel. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they neared the glass. "Don't." The voice came again, soft and insistent, but this time it wasn't coming from all around her. It was coming from within her, like a thought that wasn't her own, an intrusive, foreign command. Her body froze, fingers mere inches from the mirror's surface. She wanted to pull away, but she couldn't. The force inside her, inside the room, was too strong, too commanding. It was as if the room had its own gravity now, pulling her in, pulling her deeper into its presence. Her mind screamed for her to move, to escape, but her body betrayed her, trapped in place, as the world around her seemed to fold in on itself. "Stay with us. We are waiting." Her pulse was deafening in her ears, and her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind, unable to latch onto anything. She could see her reflection now, clearer. The eyes staring back at her weren't her own. They were wide, too wide, and the skin stretched unnaturally tight across the face that mirrored hers. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The figure in the glass smiled, its lips stretching back in an unnatural, jagged grin. And then it spoke. "You are one of us now." The words were a whisper that cut through her soul, and in that moment, Emma felt herself fall into the mirror. Or maybe the mirror had pulled her in. She couldn't tell. She gasped as the cold glass seemed to envelop her, pulling her, twisting her body inside it, until it felt like her very being was being ripped apart. Her chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but her voice was swallowed by the endless silence. Her hands went to her neck, trying to claw away the sensation of suffocation, but there was nothing there to touch, only an invisible pressure pushing against her, squeezing her tighter with each passing second. Her body tensed as the suffocating weight of the room bore down on her, constricting until she thought she would break. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the pressure lifted, the coldness retreated, the oppressive stillness dissipated, but Emma was no longer standing in front of the mirror. She was somewhere else. The world around her was not familiar. It was dark, no, unnatural. There was no light here, no warmth, just an endless void stretching out in every direction. It was as if the room itself had been consumed by the darkness, swallowed whole by the void that had been lurking just beneath its surface. She couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the ground, as if bound by invisible chains. Her arms hung limp at her sides, useless. Her heart raced, but she could feel nothing except the pounding of it in her chest. The air was still, yet there was an unmistakable hum, a vibration that seemed to reverberate from deep within the ground beneath her. It was a constant noise, a low thrumming sound that felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And then, from the darkness, she felt it, a shift, a ripple in the air, as if something was moving toward her. It was faint at first, just a whisper of a presence, a brush against the edges of her consciousness. But it grew louder, more distinct, a sound like 1,000 feet shuffling, dragging across the floor, each step slow and deliberate. She could feel it now, the presence closing in on her, like the air itself was thickening, pressing against her, surrounding her. She wanted to move. She had to, but her body remained frozen, paralyzed with fear. The shuffling stopped. Silence. Then the whispering started. At first, it was faint, just a murmur, a distant sound she couldn't quite place. It was coming from all around her, too many voices overlapping, blending together into a cacophony of unintelligible sound. Her head snapped from side to side, trying to locate the source. But there was nothing. No one. It was just her and the void. We are waiting. The whisper, now clearer, came from behind her. She turned slowly, fear creeping up her spine. But what she saw made her blood run cold. A figure stood in the distance, just outside the reach of the darkness. She couldn't make out its features, only that it was tall, its form shifting in and out of focus as if it were made of smoke. It wasn't entirely solid, but it was there, and it was looking at her. The air around her grew colder still, a sharp, biting chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her breath came out in clouds of white vapor, but the figure, whatever it was, remained still, unmoving. Emma opened her mouth to scream, to ask it what it wanted, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't make a sound. She could only watch as the figure began to move toward her, its steps slow, deliberate, dragging like an ancient thing, coming to claim her. "Stay with us." The voice now came from the figure itself, clear and powerful, resonating through the air like the echo of something old and terrible. The figure stepped forward again, and Emma felt herself take a step back, though she couldn't remember moving. Her feet slid over the floor, but there was no ground beneath her. She was floating, drifting, as the figure's presence grew larger, closer. She tried to scream again, but the words were lost. All that remained was the feeling that the darkness was pulling her in, that whatever had claimed the room was now reaching for her with open arms, welcoming her into its suffocating embrace. The figure reached out. Its hand, long and skeletal, seemed to stretch across the void toward her. She couldn't look away. She couldn't run. And then, nothing. The darkness swallowed her whole.